Good morning, friends. The light through my window is the kind that looks fragile, like it might shatter if you stare at it too hard. The kettle is rattling on the stove and the house is still too still. Maybe you're just easing into your first coffee, or maybe you're curled under the blankets pretending you have another hour before work. Either way, I'm grateful you've wandered here with me. Let me tell you a bold truth to sip alongside your morning cup. You might not survive if you keep believing family always shows up when it matters most. Sometimes the people you expect to hold you are the very ones who step back and let you fall. So before we wander deeper into this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time of day it is. Now lower the lights if you want, maybe let the hum of a fan keep you company. And let's step into this morning together. Edward Montgomery. My husband of 45 years left this world on a Thursday morning. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. His hand went slack in mine, and the machines traced flat lines like they were drawing the end of a sentence. At the funeral, neighbors hugged me with hands that squeezed too tightly. They meant well, I suppose. They filled the house with casseroles that all tasted like cream of something. Grief makes people cling to recipes as if butter and broth can mend broken ribs. My son David stood tall beside me, his jaw clenched. He looked the part of the dutiful son, but his eyes kept flicking toward Vanessa. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, whispering about how we'll move forward. That phrase clanged in my ears like a dropped pan. Move forward. My husband was barely in the ground. Odd fact of the day, Victorians wore mourning black for 2 years, but they also invented mourning jewelry made from the deceased's hair. A gruesome craft, yes, but at least they respected the timeline of grief. No one told them to reset after a week. By the time the guest had left, Vanessa was already talking about plans. We'll handle the house, the bills, everything she said, with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. David nodded mutely beside her as though rehearsing agreement. That night I wandered the house, fingers brushing Edward's glasses, the worn arm of his recliner, the folded newspaper he'd left on the kitchen table. Grief wasn't just sorrow, it was static in the air, humming from every object he touched. But louder than grief was the echo of Vanessa's voice. We'll handle everything. I opened a clean notebook, drew a steady line at the top of the page, and wrote my first entry. If casseroles cured grief, I'd never die. If silence were loyalty, David is a saint. And me, I may be broken, but I am not blind. I slid the journal beneath my pillow. For the first time since Edward's last breath, I felt a plan beginning to stir. The next morning, I woke to the sound of drawers opening in the kitchen. For a split second, I imagined Edward shuffling about looking for his favorite mug. But when I stepped into the doorway, there was Vanessa, her perfect manicure wrapped around my cast iron skillet. "Oh, Helen," she said with exaggerated surprise, "I didn't want to wake you. I just thought I'd make breakfast. You need rest." Her tone wasn't kindness, it was possession. She moved through my kitchen like a realtor, staging a house opening cabinets, rearranging mugs, humming as though she belonged here. David sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up once, then looked down again. "She's only trying to help, Mom," he muttered. I wanted to scream, "This is my kitchen, my house, my life." But I swallowed the words. Grief teaches you to measure silence like teaspoons. Breakfast arrived in neat little portions. I pushed the plate away gently. "I'm not hungry." Vanessa's smile tightened sharp as a paper cut. "You need strength. People will start to worry if you don't eat." Her words stuck like burrs. People will worry. Not her, not David, just the faceless people she liked to invoke. Odd fact of the day in anthropology kitchens are considered the symbolic heart of the home. Watching Vanessa reorder my cupboards was like watching someone rearrange my ribs. Later, I noticed Edward's photo from our 40th anniversary had vanished from the mantel. In its place stood a vase of lilies with a card from David and Vanessa. That night, I wrote in my journal, "If kindness had fingerprints, hers would smear. If silence were a shield, David hides behind it. And me, I may be grieving, but I'm not blind." I placed the journal next to Edward's glasses on the nightstand. His absence still ached, but the act of recording made me feel less erased. I began carrying my journal like armor tucked into the pocket of my cardigan. Every word Vanessa spoke, every glance she threw, I set down in ink. Paper doesn't lie the way people do. The small humiliations stacked up like coins in a jar. She corrected me in front of neighbors. Helen means Wednesday, not Thursday. She held loud phone calls in my living room, dropping phrases like estate accounts, property transfer words, not meant for my ears, but planted like seeds of intimidation. David drifted through these moments like a ghost. His presence was there, but empty. His loyalty folded neatly into silence. Sometimes he looked at me as though he wanted to say something, but the words died before reaching his lips. One afternoon, Vanessa perched across from me at the kitchen table, her hands folded as though in prayer. "Helen, you really shouldn't worry about bills or paperwork. Let David and me take care of it. You've been through so much." I smiled politely, lifted my pen, and spoke the words aloud as I wrote them. "You really shouldn't worry about bills." Her eyes flickered only for a second, but it was there. She knew I was keeping score. Odd fact of the day, medieval monks copied scriptures, not only to preserve them, but to anchor truth against time. Each stroke of ink was both prayer and protection. My journal was becoming the same sanctuary and shield. That evening, I flipped back through earlier entries, the lilies replacing Edward's photo, the rearranged cupboards the word reset muttered at his funeral, on their own annoyances. Together, a pattern too deliberate to ignore. I wrote my closing lines. "If politeness were a sport, Vanessa cheats at it. If silence were currency, David's a millionaire. And me, I grieve, yes, but I also record." When I closed the journal, its weight steadied me. Every page was proof that I wasn't imagining the storm. A week later, Vanessa arrived with a brightness that rang false, her heels clicking against the tile like warning shots. "Helen," she said, sweeping into the living room, "why don't we all have a nice dinner together? Just us as a family. We need to heal to move forward." Her words dripped with syrup, but I heard the sharpness beneath. Heal and move forward were her favorite weapons phrases that sounded benevolent, but were designed to corner me. David nodded automatically, as if agreeing had become muscle memory. "It's a good idea, Mom," he added, his voice flat. I smiled faintly, though my chest tightened. A family dinner in theory could have been comfort. In Vanessa's hands, it was stagecraft. Odd fact of the day, in ancient Rome, feasts were often political. Who sat where, who poured the wine, who spoke first, all carried meaning. The dinner table was less about food than about power. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, journal open on my lap. I wrote her invitation in full, pausing after each word. We need to heal. We need to move forward. The phrasing wasn't suggestion, it was command dressed as care. Patricia, my neighbor, stopped by the next morning. When I mentioned the dinner, she frowned. "Something's off. Be careful." I promised her I would. Still, when the evening came, I couldn't shake the unease. Vanessa arranged the dining room with an almost ceremonial precision, candles, burning low silver-polished chairs, positioned with military order. As I took my seat at the long table, I felt the air tighten. This wasn't just a meal. It was something else, and I knew I had walked into a performance where I was meant to play the fool. In my notebook later, I wrote, "If dinners were medicine, this one tasted like poison. If silence were choreography, David was dancing it well. And me, I may have sat at her table, but I won't eat her script." The first thing I noticed that night wasn't the food. It was the strangers. 5 men in dark suits sat along one side of the table, their briefcases neatly stacked by their chairs. Their plates were untouched, their eyes sharp, their smiles thin. I knew lawyers when I saw them. Vanessa beamed. Helen, I thought it would be good to have some professionals here just to make sure everything is handled smoothly. David stared at his lap. Noah squirmed in his booster seat, blissfully unaware that this wasn't family, it was ambush. I forced my voice calm. Professionals for dinner, how unusual. One of the lawyers cleared his throat. Mrs. Montgomery, we're here to help facilitate transitions. It's standard practice. I raised an eyebrow. Transitions. Vanessa leaned in, her smile polished. Mother, you've been under so much stress. We just want to ensure the house, the accounts, even custody matters for Noah are secure. For everyone's peace of mind. Her words settled over the table like a net. I glanced at David, hoping for his intervention, but his silence was stone. Odd fact of the day, the word banquet comes from the Italian banchetto, meaning little bench. In medieval times, banquets weren't just meals, they were negotiations, plots, treaties. Tonight's bench was heavy oak, and the treaty was my life. I looked around at the polished silver, the carefully folded napkins, the stack of documents sitting just beyond the candlelight. This wasn't reconciliation. It was litigation in disguise. Later in my journal, I wrote, if dinners are supposed to nourish, this one starved me. If lawyers were spices, mine came heavily seasoned. And me, I may have been lured to the table, but I'm not about to be devoured. I folded the page, slowly aware that the real feast was yet to begin. The papers appeared before dessert. Vanessa slid a neat stack across the table, her nails tapping the top page like a drum roll. Just some simple agreements, Helen, she said, voice honey smooth. Household matters, finances, Noah's care. Nothing complicated. One of the lawyers chimed in. Purely procedural. You'll remain comfortable, of course, but with less stress. Your signature simply acknowledges that you're allowing David and Vanessa to handle the administrative burdens. I glanced down. The words on the page were dense, but I knew enough to recognize the trap guardianship clauses, property transfers, waivers, tucked between paragraphs like landmines. David shifted in his chair. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. You've gone to a lot of trouble, I said softly. All this for my comfort. Vanessa's smile stretched thinner. Of course. We just want what's best for you. Odd fact of the day, the word signature comes from the Latin signare, to mark. In ancient times, a mark wasn't just agreement, it was identity, binding one's very self. They weren't asking me to sign papers, they were asking me to erase myself. I picked up the pen they had laid beside the stack, rolling it between my fingers. Funny, I said lightly, how comfort looks an awful lot like surrender. Vanessa's eyes hardened, but she kept her tone soft. You're imagining things, Helen. We're your family. The word family clanged in my chest like a cracked bell. Later, when I wrote in my journal, I chose my truths carefully. If contracts were cages, this one had gilded bars. If loyalty had a voice, David's was mute. And me, I may be cornered, but I still have claws. I closed the journal knowing the game had only begun. I didn't sign. Instead, I smiled, asked for another roll from the breadbasket, and spoke of Noah's school projects as though the stack of contracts wasn't breathing fire between us. My refusal was quiet, but it was absolute. Vanessa's patience thinned. Helen, she said sweetly, her jaw tight, there's no reason to stall. Everyone here has taken time out of their evening. It would be rude to waste it. I tore the roll in half, the steam curling upward. I was raised to never sign anything on an empty stomach. One of the lawyers chuckled, not with me, but at the absurdity of the moment. Vanessa shot him a look sharp enough to slice. Odd fact of the day, the word strategy comes from the Greek strategos, meaning general of the army. A general doesn't swing his sword first, he studies maneuvers, waits. Tonight I was learning to be my own general. I watched the room carefully. One lawyer leaned forward, his tone more insistent. Mrs. Montgomery's hesitation only complicates matters. It would be better for everyone if you signed tonight. I smiled, dipped my roll in butter, and said nothing. Inside, though, my mind sharpened. I'd anticipated something like this. Copies of Edward's will. My deeds and recent account statements were already secured in a safe deposit box. Patricia had one sealed envelope labeled "In case of emergency." And tomorrow, I would meet with Charles Whitman, my own attorney, who already suspected Vanessa's games. When the dinner ended, Vanessa gathered the untouched papers, her smile frozen. "We'll try again," she said, her voice as brittle as glass. Later, in the safety of my bedroom, I wrote, "If patience were a weapon, mine is loaded. If silence were strategy tonight, it was my shield. And me, I'm no fool at her feast." I slid the journal under my pillow and slept lightly, dreaming of battles not yet fought. The next week, they tried again. Vanessa arrived mid-morning with a casserole dish in one hand and a new stack of papers in the other. She set them on the counter like offerings, her smile stretched so wide it looked painful. "Just thought I'd stop by," she said, sliding the documents closer. "It's easier if you sign when you're relaxed, Helen. No pressure, of course." David trailed behind her shoulders, slumped eyes fixed on the floorboards. He didn't touch the food, he didn't touch the papers, he just let the silence do the heavy lifting. I picked up the top page, scanning. The language was smoother now, less blunt, more gentle. But the clause were still there. One clause promised long-term security if I appointed David and Vanessa as financial guardians. Another spoke of household transitions that would, in plain terms, strip me of my home. Odd fact of the day, in medieval courts, lawyers were called sergeants, meaning servants. They weren't supposed to dominate, only to guide. Somewhere along the centuries, that definition was buried. I set the papers down and asked lightly, "Tell me, Vanessa, how much did this stack cost to draft 5 lawyers at dinner?" "Can't be cheap." Her smile faltered. "Don't be dramatic. It's just family business." "Family business doesn't usually need notarized signatures and legal witnesses," I replied. The room went quiet. Noah's toy car clattered across the floor, the only sound. I placed my palm on the papers, then slid them back across the counter. No, her eyes darkened. For a heartbeat, I thought she might raise her voice, but instead, she forced another brittle smile. "You're tired. We'll talk later." That night, I wrote, "If contracts are traps, repetition is the bait. If David's silence were a language, it speaks louder than words. And me, I won't sign myself into disappearance." I tucked the journal away, knowing their patience was thinning, and that was my advantage. The harder they pressed, the calmer I became. It startled even me. Patricia came over one afternoon with lemon bars wrapped in foil. When I told her about the second round of papers, she shook her head. "They're desperate, Helen. Desperate people make mistakes. Let them." She was right. So I began preparing my countermove. The next morning, I carried my yellow folder journal entries, photocopies of Edward's will, and every suspicious document to Charles Whitman's office. He read silently, tapping the edge of each page. By the time he looked up, his mouth was a thin line. "This is a pattern of coercion," he said. "They've already crossed lines. If you'd like, I can file an injunction." Odd fact of the day, the word injunction comes from the Latin injungere, meaning to join or impose. In law, it doesn't just stop an action, it binds someone under order. In other words, a leash. I didn't want drama, but I did want safety, so we arranged contingencies. Copies of my evidence were sealed in multiple places. Letters were drafted for court if needed, and Charles promised to monitor developments. Back at home, Vanessa's sweetness curdled into irritation. She asked pointed questions. "Have you been speaking to anyone, lawyers?" Maybe I deflected with a smile. "I have tea with Patricia, if that's what you mean." David looked at me, then really looked at me, his eyes heavy with something like shame. But still no words came. That night I wrote in my journal, "If evidence is sight, then I finally see clearly. If guilt is gravity, David is sinking fast. And me, I'm no longer cornered. I'm positioning." The storm wasn't over, but for the first time I felt the ground shifting under my feet, and it was tilting in my favor.
The confrontation came quicker than I expected. A gray morning rain tapping the windows, and Vanessa stormed in with David trailing like a shadow. She carried another set of documents, this time thinner slicker, as if streamlining the trap would make me more likely to fall in. "Enough delays, Helen," she said, laying them flat on the dining table. "This is just a matter of signatures. No more excuses." I poured tea into my cup, steady hands, despite the storm in her eyes. "You're awfully determined for someone doing me a favor." She forced a laugh. "We're family! That's what family does." Odd fact of the day, the word family stems from the Latin familia, which originally meant household slaves. Not exactly the warmth we imagine today. David sat, his fingers tapping the edge of the table. He looked at me once, then away. I could almost hear the words locked in his throat. I set down my cup and pulled a manila envelope from the sideboard. "Interesting timing," I said, "because Charles Whitman has been quite interested in these little gatherings." Her face blanched, then hardened. "You went to a lawyer?" "Of course," I replied, sliding the envelope across. Inside were copies of her forged notes, my journal entries, and Charles's preliminary draft for injunction. "Did you really think I wouldn't?" David's head snapped toward me, eyes wide. For a second, hope flickered there, a hope that maybe I'd save him from his own silence. Vanessa's mask cracked. "This is ridiculous. You're imagining conspiracies." But even as she hissed, her hands trembled. That night I wrote, "If paper is power, mine is stacked higher. If silence is complicity, David has nowhere left to hide. And me, I am done playing the guest at my own table." The rain eased outside. For the first time in months, I felt the air lighten. The standoff at the table didn't end with signatures. It ended with truths. Vanessa's voice sharpened as she tried to claw back control. "Do you think a court will listen to you over documented plans and guardianship agreements?" I lifted an eyebrow. "Documented? You mean forged?" I slid another page across her own handwriting in pencil on a mislaid insurance statement notes in the margins about limits and liquidation. David's face went pale. He stared at the page, then at her. His lips parted. You told me those were just reminders." She snapped, "Don't be naive, David. This is about security for all of us." Odd fact of the day, the word revelation comes from the Latin revelare, meaning to lay bare. And in that moment, everything Vanessa had hidden was bare as bone. David finally spoke, his voice cracking. "Security or greed?" "Because you lied to me. About Noah. About everything." Her eyes darted toward him, then back to me. It was quick, but I caught it. And so did he. He stood pushing his chair back so hard it screeched. "Tell her, Vanessa. Tell my mother what you told me that night you thought I was too drunk to remember." She froze, lips tight. David's voice was hoarse. "Noah isn't mine. He never was he?" Silence fell heavy and final. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa looked down, her mask shattered into shards too sharp to gather. That night in my journal, my hand shook as I wrote, "If lies are seeds, hers have bloomed into thorns." If truth is a blade, David finally unsheathed it. And me, I no longer feel alone at this table. The papers on the table meant nothing now. The real document was the confession hanging in the air. The house was still after Vanessa's mask cracked. The lawyers packed their briefcases in silence, sensing there was no case left to argue. One by one, they excused themselves, leaving only the four of us, me, David, Vanessa, and little Noah, playing with his toy car on the floor, blissfully unaware that the walls of his world had just collapsed. David's voice trembled, but it was steady enough to cut. "All this time, you let me raise him as mine. You let my mother believe he was her grandson. And for what? To keep your scheme alive." Vanessa's hands fluttered, searching for words, but none came. She had built her kingdom on deception, and now the foundation had cracked wide open. Odd fact of the day, the word betrayal comes from Old French trahir, meaning to hand over. That night, Vanessa handed over her own mask piece by jagged piece. She left the house without a word, the sound of her heels fading down the driveway like the end of a bad play. David sank into a chair, head in his hands. Mom, I didn't want to see it. I thought silence would keep the peace. But silence only fed the fire. I placed a hand on his shoulder, the anger and love tangling in my chest. You see now, that's what matters. We can rebuild. The weeks that followed were slow but healing. Charles filed to secure my estate, fully leaving no gaps. Vanessa's name became a whisper in town, a cautionary tale. Noah stayed with David, who vowed to raise him with honesty this time, no matter the pain of truth. As for me, I reclaimed my days. Gardening in the mornings, painting again, even traveling with Patricia to the coast. The house no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a sanctuary, mine alone. On Edward's birthday, I lit a candle at the kitchen table and whispered, "I'm safe. I'm free." The flame flickered steady and sure. In my final journal entry, I wrote, "If peace is soil, mine is freshly turned. If truth is air, I can finally breathe deep. And me, I am no longer surviving betrayal. I am thriving beyond it." Helen Montgomery, widowed at 68, struggles with grief after her husband Edward's death. Instead of comfort, she finds subtle domination from her daughter-in-law, Vanessa. David, her son, chooses silence, leaving Helen feeling erased in her own home. Helen begins documenting every slight in a journal, heirlooms, removed cupboards, rearranged comments about resetting life. When Vanessa invites her to a family dinner, Helen realizes too late it's an ambush, 5 lawyers waiting at the table, contracts designed to strip her of home finances and authority. Though shaken, Helen refuses to sign. She plays the long game, quietly preparing with her own attorney, Charles Whitman, and enlisting Patricia, her loyal neighbor, as ally. Vanessa escalates, presenting forged documents and pushing harder, but Helen counters with documentation and calm resistance. The truth erupts in a final confrontation. David, long silent, breaks when Helen exposes forged paperwork. He demands answers, and Vanessa's ultimate deception comes to light. Noah, the boy they'd raised as Helen's grandson, is not David's child. The revelation collapses Vanessa's schemes, shattering her mask and sending her out the door in disgrace. With legal protection secured and Vanessa gone, Helen begins to heal. David acknowledges his silence and vows honesty, especially for Noah's sake. The house once suffocating becomes Helen's sanctuary again. In the months that follow, Helen rebuilds a life of her choosing. Gardening, painting, traveling. She finds strength in truth and peace in independence. Her journal, once her shield, becomes her testimony of resilience. In the end, betrayal doesn't define her. Freedom does.